ago, there was a study that showed that children whose mothers are stressed or depressed are more likely to have asthma than other kids. So the mother's stress or depression can trigger asthma in the child. Now the researchers, being medical doctors, had no way to understand that finding. What does the mother's stress or depression have to do with the kid's lungs? Well, they were confused only because they hadn't read my book, When the Body Says No, where I talked about this stuff 7 or 8 years ago, because it's not new information. It's just that the information comes out and it's not incorporated into the medical perspective on things. Now, why a child whose mother is stressed or depressed is more likely to have asthma is very straightforward scientifically. Very straightforward. Has anybody here ever been treated for asthma? You have? Okay. A couple of you. What medications were you given? Ventolin and Flovent. Okay, so you received 2 inhalers. One was called Ventolin. What happens in asthma is you get narrowing of the airways. The muscles that surround the breathing tubes go into spasm. And so the Ventolin is called a bronchodilator because it dilates up the air tubes by relaxing those muscles. So now the air can flow more freely through a larger caliber tube. The other aspect of asthma is inflammation. You get swelling and inflammatory debris cluttering up the airway. So the Flovent inhaler is designed to suppress the inflammation. Now the Ventolin is a copy of adrenaline. It's a direct copy of adrenaline. And the Flovent is a steroid, a direct copy of cortisol. Okay? Now, some of you are beginning to follow this. Does anybody know what cortisol and adrenaline are? They're stress hormones. They're the body's own stress hormones made by our own adrenal gland. In other words, we're treating the asthmatic with stress hormones. Why? Because their stress mechanisms have been overwhelmed and now we have to give them extra hormones to keep their airways open. And why the airways of a child whose mother is stressed or depressed, the emotional states of the parents do so much to program the physiology of children. The number of childhood visits for mental health disorders in Windsor, Ontario went up 50% in the year 2009. Any idea why that should happen in Windsor, Ontario? It's an auto-making town, heavily hit by the economic crisis. When the parents are stressed, the children get stressed, and now the kids are diagnosed and medicated. So that's in childhood. I'm not blaming mothers here, by the way, for being stressed or depressed. Nobody chooses to be stressed or depressed. I'm just saying that when you are, your kids suffer. The reason we're seeing so much more of this condition now than we did 50 years ago is not because it's a genetic disease, which it isn't. Most physicians think it is, it isn't. It's not an inherited disease. What it is a response of the brain to childhood stress. Because the brain develops under the impact of the environment, which is not something I can go into right now, but it just happens to be a fact. And if we're seeing a lot more stressed parents, we're going to see a lot of kids whose brains reflect the early stresses in their environment. And that's why I'm seeing so much more autism and everything else. Not because there's been a genetic explosion of some kind, but simply because the environment has become so stressed. That's in the beginning of life. Now in midlife, there was a study in Australia where they looked at 500 women with breast lumps. And they found that women who had been, before they were biopsied or before the biopsy results came back, so these women had breast biopsies. Before the results came back, whether the lump was cancerous or not, they had a psychological interview. It turned out after the results came back that if the woman had had a major stressful episode in her life in the months prior to the onset of that lump, that by itself had no effect on the lump being cancerous, 0 effect. And if a woman was emotionally isolated, that also by itself had no consequence on that lump being cancerous, 0 effect. So far so good. But if a woman was emotionally isolated and had a major stressful episode in her life, the chance of that lump being cancerous was 9 times as great as the average. And again, the researchers, being medical doctors, couldn't understand this. How does 0 effect and 0 effect add up to 9? How does 0 and 0 multiply to 9? But again, it's only because they have a very narrow medical mindset. If you understand it in scientific and human terms, you know very well when you're stressed and your cortisol levels are high, your adrenaline levels are high, and your blood pressure is high, and your nervous system is discharging in a highly triggered fashion. And if somebody comes along and says who you're connected with and who you trust and who's got some compassion, and they say to you, hey friend, hey sweetheart, hey buddy, how you doing? I can see that you're having a hard time. What happens to you? And puts a hand on your shoulder and says, let's talk about it. What happens to you physically? You relax. The cortisol levels go down, the adrenaline levels go down. Cortisol over the long time suppresses the immune system. If you're stewing in your own cortisol for a long time, that'll suppress the immune system and make that lump, permit that lump to turn cancerous. In other words, the difference was the relationship that these people had with other people. That's what made the difference. Just as with those asthmatic kids. And at the end of life, a study in the New England Journal of Medicine showed that in an elderly couple who've been together for a long time, when one of them gets sick, gets hospitalized, what do you suppose happens in the other one? They have more of a chance of getting ill themselves because their immune systems are hooked into one another. That's who we are as human beings. We're deeply hooked into one another. From the beginning of life, from conception onwards to the very end. So what happens to pregnant women has a huge impact actually on the development of their children. Now, there's no time when we're as dependent on relationships and as affected by relationships as during childhood. Why? Because during childhood that we're the most dependent and the most helpless. So that we need those relationships. And that's called attachment. Attachment is the connection between one human being to another. But attachment isn't there as a luxury. Attachment is a human need because of the utter helplessness and defenselessness and dependence of the human child. So attachment is a life necessity. And attachment serves the purpose of being taken care of if you're the dependent, or taking care of if you're the caregiver. So if you're attached to the people that you're looking after, you'll do a good job. If you don't care, you will not do such a good job. So attachment is essential for human life. And of course, the child has to be attached as well, otherwise he can't be taken care of. So children who detach, for example, children who are badly abused, and they detach to defend themselves, they can't be taken care of. You have to first connect with them before you can take care of them. Even my dog, Rosie, who's 12 years old, and I'm the alpha person in her life. When I wake up in the morning, until I go downstairs, she doesn't budge, she doesn't come down. But when I've been away, as I'm away on speaking trips a lot these days, and this time I won't be home for 4 weeks, I know what's going to happen. When I come home, she won't come to me, she won't run, she'll actually start shaking when she sees me. And she won't come over to me. Why? Because she's detached to defend herself against the pain of loss. And it's going to take a day or so, or me rubbing her back and taking her for walks, for her to connect with me again. So when you're detaching, you can't be taken care of. Because we have this huge need to attach. So basically, human beings are biologically wired to attach. And again, the reason we're seeing so many kids in trouble these days with these various diagnoses is because their attachment relationships have been so disturbed early in life because of stress in the parenting environment. Because human beings were never meant to be parented in the way that we're parenting kids today. What we have today is a completely unnatural aberration, a recent one. Because human beings always developed in the context of a clan, tribe, village, community, extended family. The nuclear family was never the unit of child rearing. In fact, the nuclear family didn't used to exist, not in the sense of an isolated entity. If you look at successful parenting practices, you have to look at Aboriginal peoples, such as the way that the First Nations people parented their kids before the coming of the Caucasians. They parented in community. It takes a village to raise a child. The child wasn't just connected to mom and dad. The child was connected to uncles and aunts and the tribe members and the elders, of course. Now that's all broken down in modern life. And as the African saying, it takes a village to raise a child. And when you walk down a village in Africa, even today, complete kids completely strange kids who've never laid eyes on you before will say, hello uncle, hello aunt, because they're relating to you as attachment figures, because that's how they relate to adults in general. So what we have